After a couple of masterpieces and a whole lot of, well, I guess you can call Lady in the Water an old movies in at least the elementary sense, M. Night Shyamalan has finally charted a new path, making the bold, auteurist choice to come out with a movie that doesn't really leave a strong impression in either direction. Yeah, so Knock at the Cabin has knocked at the doors of theaters everywhere. It even dethroned Avatar 2 at the box office. And now that we're all done marveling at how Dave Bautista just doesn't miss as a performer, I want to take a look at why the overall film, I want to say, doesn't work, and in a lot of ways it doesn't, but I think it's more accurate to say that Shyamalan gets in his own way repeatedly and prevents the film's potential from ever really breaking through the surface. I do think it's a little interesting how Shyamalan, who has spent his career playing in the extremes of quality, has made something as dull yet not bad enough to be hate-watched as this, but it's much more interesting, and also kind of impressive, how he's taken such an out-there idea, not to mention an incredible lead performance, and done so little with it. So I think more than whether or not Knock at the Cabin is good or bad, it's worth looking at it more from the perspective of what the film could have been on paper and how its potential impact is repeatedly dulled in execution. Something, you know, that kind of tends to happen with a lot of Shyamalan films, at least in my opinion. It's a film that feels afraid of its own shadow, the entry in Shyamalan's filmography which is most devoid of risk-taking, outside of, you know, some interesting framing and cinematography and all that. Say what you will about how well, Unbreakable, or poorly, Glass, his risk-taking has panned out, it's arguably the thing that most contributes to how fascinating a filmmaker Shyamalan is, which in turn makes this his least fascinating film. And it's nothing to do with twists, I'd say Knock at the Cabin doesn't even have one, but rather that the film has little to say, even though in terms of literal words and ideas, it's saying a lot. It's predictable in a cheap way, and Shyamalan seemingly has so little faith in his audience, certainly not a first for him, and even the film's only remaining crutch to lean on, ambiguity, is completely washed away. So yes, it's a lot more to unpack than just good or bad or even middling. I mean, I'd say if you're gonna put a label on Knock at the Cabin, it's disappointing. My feelings about the film are complicated, and it's an overall mess. I suppose you'd better unlock the door and let FilmSpeak in. We're gonna be here for a while. Knock at the Cabin begins with a little girl, Wen, catching grasshoppers in the woods. Wen, we soon learn, is the adopted daughter of a gay couple who are taking their vacation here. Wen's method of capturing the grasshoppers involves putting them into a jar with a hole-poked lid on top. This is where Dave Bautista's Leonard enters the story and has a conversation with Wen where he reveals he too enjoys capturing grasshoppers. He urges her to be gentle so as not to spook the insects. It foreshadows the latter actions of Leonard and his co-antagonists and sets up the events of the rest of the film. Leonard is not here to talk about grasshoppers, though. He's here to hold these people hostage because the world depends on it. Knock at the Cabin's issues and positives alike are all rooted in this premise. The apocalypse is coming, and only the sacrifice of a member of this specific loving family can halt its advance. I'd wager you can grab anyone's attention with that idea. Great. Obviously, you want your audience to be engaged. You've got them asking questions, but one question in particular is probably dominant in most of the audience's minds. Are the people who say the apocalypse is coming telling the truth? You can sustain a mystery for an hour and a half on the back of a question like that. Where Shyamalan falters is in definitively confirming, in the first 30 minutes of the film, mind you, that yes, doomsday has arrived, however you see it. The end of the world due to ecological collapse, the rapture, whatever. Before repeatedly having the family choose whether or not to capitulate and bring an end to the nightmare or to survive and see the end of humanity through. The entire hour of the film that follows has no story beyond the apocalypse is getting worse. And if it weren't for how engaging the performances are, Dave Bautista and Ben Aldridge in particular making a gourmet meal from a nothing burger, I genuinely doubt people would actually stick the film out the way they have been. In a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of The Village, where the reveal sort of just happens, and then Shyamalan sort of pedals back on it. He's like, well, but is it really, or is it not? And yes, it's fun to kind of play with audience expectations and the twist reel convention, but I think once you've already kind of set the stage that, yes, something is going on, whether it's doomsday or not, that doesn't really matter. So this back and forth over the one question sort of gets a bit tiresome. It stretches itself too thin, and truthfully, I don't know that a premise like this is able to sustain the 100+ minute runtime of the film. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's tense for a good chunk of it, even after it's revealed that some form of doomsday has arrived. And a lot of that comes down to Shyamalan's very intrusive, extreme close-ups, his awkward framing that puts you on edge. And I gotta give him a lot of credit for that, because it's probably some of his most inventive camera work we've ever seen. But back to the matter at hand. So Leonard and his band of strangers with prophetic visions trap the family in their cabin, much in the way Wen traps her grasshoppers, and aim for the same benevolence. They try their best to keep the hostages calm as they consider sacrificing one of their own. Obviously, this doesn't go well. How could it? But it is nonetheless what they endeavor to try and do. These efforts at gentle enclosure include attending to their medical needs, keeping Wen safe, and giving the family their own backstory so as to help humanize themselves. The cabin itself is an allegory for the grasshopper jar. As they enter, there's no chance for escape. They can be as gentle and benevolent as they want with the captured family, but they are nonetheless holding them hostage, an inherently malicious and harmful thing, no matter how many holes they poke in the lid. It's a strong metaphor and something deliberate from Shyamalan, but it also serves as an emblematic reminder of the remainder of the film. You, the audience, are stuck in this cabin too, and you're not going to make much headway until the film's final salvo spells everything out for you. On the topic of things that are unsubtle, Wen's parents' names. The names of the two people who have the fate of humanity thrust into their hands are Andrew and Eric. A and E. Adam and Eve. Is the symbolism shallower than a puddle? Yes. Is it groan-inducingly obvious? Yes. Was it Shyamalan's idea to give these two characters those names? No. Those names are carried over from the novel on which the film is based, but in keeping those names the way they are, it's also the first hint that Shyamalan has made a complete mess of whatever attempt he was making at a societal commentary or representation or any of the myriad of things this screen couple can represent because of how he changed the ending. If you take the Bible at its literal word, Adam and Eve committed the original sin, casting a mark on the eyes of all humanity who came after them. Is that supposedly to mean that Andrew and Eric are paying back the debt of that sin? Is the script trying to say that their love for one another and their family is the quote-unquote sin that has brought the apocalypse about? Because that reads in a very awful way, especially considering what's going on in the United States right now with all the hyperbolic and flat-out bullshit rhetoric being spread about the LGBTQ+ community by extremist voices. I want to make something clear. I don't think Shyamalan wanted this message to come across the way that it did. I do, however, think that the optics of keeping that completely inessential element of the book, considering how he changed the ending, aren't the greatest. And this is only one minor thing in comparison to what comes later on. Now, before we get to that, if you strip away the religious allegory, I'll concede that there's still an attempt at saying something else here. Kind of like in The Happening, it's a story that kind of speaks to the environmental crisis facing us today. The film asks, are we going to do something about all the shit going on, or are we literally going to wait until ecological collapse is knocking at our door? The science pretty soundly points to how bad things will be if we let our emissions continue to spiral out of control. And let's be clear, it's more than just emissions, but still. Could the theories and models be wrong? Sure. Is there anything we would lose if we tried to fix things that we can't afford to lose? Not really, so why gamble the other way? It's not a perfect allegory. No one is asking us to sacrifice members of our family to combat climate change, although it may feel that way to some people. And the disconnect between stakes only helps to make the film even messier, but I can at least see the commentary. Are we willing to be selfless? Every generation has had to make a sacrifice of some sort, and because those previous generations have also added to this environmental crisis we're facing today, we're gonna have to make some sacrifices too, albeit different than how previous generations have had to. But if we want to prevent permanent environmental damage that is going to affect our livelihood in a big way, we have to do something about it. And we have to do something about it so that our children and our children's children can live in a world where they can pursue what they want to pursue, where they can be happy, where they can find love and live a full life. Live a life with the privileges we have in their own way. To give Shyamalan a bit of a benefit of the doubt, I think the inconvenient truth of it all is that whenever we're faced with these decisions, it's never going to be fair, because centuries of humans before us were poor custodians and lit the fuse of so many of our contemporary problems. At the same time, many of those generations had to make sacrifices of their own, whether it be the endless wars, disease, economic hardships made so much worse by limited technology. And as painful as it is to witness, even today, the most marginalized people in this country, in the world, have to experience no-win scenarios on a daily basis. Andrew and Eric are trapped in a situation that isn't fair to them, and maybe their being a gay couple adds a resonance of observation that wouldn't be there if they were a straight couple. Shyamalan has expressed his belief that it's because of their pure, selfless love. So, like I said, I don't think he came at this with any sort of negative intention, contrary to what some people believe. At least there's a positive spin on non-heteronormative love and family life. Despite the obstacles and hatred and bigotry they face, they still chose their life and still chose to find happiness. The problems arise because Shyamalan is painting in broad strokes, meaning well but not realizing the mixed messaging of having a gay couple at the center of a deeply religious story like this. He's not seeing the harmful disconnect between the representation in the story and the unfortunate implications that a gay couple are the shepherds, quote unquote, of the apocalypse, that they are the ones who can choose to bring an end to it only if they cause themselves unspeakable heartbreak and, in a sense, bury who they truly are. The unclear and repetitive motivations behind the story don't help its case either. Eric's struggles with his sense of belief, the way quasi-religious imagery seems to slowly win him over, doesn't have anything in the script that properly explains it beyond, I saw something. I don't necessarily need Shyamalan to spoon-feed me a message or be blunt, even though he winds up doing just that in this film, but I never really feel Eric's turn towards his final decision in the movie. It feels like Shyamalan looks at his watch and says, oh, we gotta start wrapping this up, and then throws in a bunch of exposition, which is so jarring and ineffective considering how on the nose he wants to be about certain things while trying to be ponderous and unclear about Eric's arc, one which ultimately ends in his death after choosing to be the one sacrificed to save humanity, because if there's even a chance his daughter can see a better tomorrow, he's willing to die to make it happen. That's all well and good, and I can, for the most part, push aside the mess to get to the core of what I know Night was trying to say, but the fact of the matter is, it's so obfuscated in the script that you have to go out of your way to interpret Knock at the Cabin in good faith. Now, that's something I generally believe in. I personally always believe in meeting a filmmaker where they're at and always trying to interpret their messaging in good faith. But here, while I'm able to do it, I can see why a lot of people may not be able to do so. I can even understand and empathize with the way people are interpreting some of the weird messaging and how harmful it could be to the LGBTQ+ community. The point is, I think this goes back to Shyamalan not being deliberate enough with what he's trying to say. It's okay to have a movie that doesn't beat you over the head with the message. I'm not asking for that, even though, again, he kind of does in the climax of the film. But when you're dealing with themes and messages like this that could get misinterpreted, I think you have to take that extra step to make sure that you're not sending the wrong signals to people. I think what he ultimately was trying to do is he was trying to intellectualize an action that was a deeply emotional response. And Shyamalan went, well, we have to make that make sense logically. We have to give this resolution. We have to have Eric rediscover his faith and have that be the reason, instead of, maybe implying that he rediscovers his faith through the imagery that you've been feeding us this entire film, and then having him say, no, I need to do this out of love because this is my child. That sends a far more positive message than, maybe these zealots were actually right. The ending to the novel is actually pretty bleak. Wen is accidentally killed during one of the family's attempts to escape Leonard, though they are also told that she does not count as a sacrifice since her death was not one willingly carried out by the family. When all is said and done, Andrew and Eric ultimately leave the cabin together. Whether or not the apocalypse is real, whether or not they've managed to bring an end to it, if it is real, doesn't matter. It's a very interestingly ambiguous note to end on, and Shyamalan decides to go a different way. Probably because a child accidentally getting shot dead is just about the only way the story could be far more dour than the one we got in the final film, but also because, well, it wouldn't be an M. Night Shyamalan film if he didn't spell everything out for his audience, right? It's also a bit weird because the original ending is clearly something that he doesn't agree with, and so this is almost his way of doing a fan fiction rewrite to fix the ending instead of looking at why the original work ended the way it did. He was writing as an audience member dissatisfied with the conclusion instead of examining the story from the character's point of view and going from there, understanding the story on a deeper level, and I just don't think he did that. And I think that's a big part of why everything is exposited in one weird climax. He was dissatisfied with the answers he got in the ending, and so he felt the need to give himself, as an audience member, those answers and then some. At the 11th hour, with mere moments to go before the doomsday clock hits midnight, Eric chooses to be the sacrifice, and Andrew carries it out. Afterwards, there's no ambiguity in the slightest. Shyamalan bashes us over the head with news reports about every single disaster, the tsunamis, the pandemic, the planes falling out of the sky have stopped. People are finding their own family members alive, and this particular family's favorite song is playing on the radio. And yes, ultimately, at the end of the day, a gay man was essentially told to kill himself for the sake of humanity, to tear his family apart because the rest of our mostly heterosexual world was more important than his happiness. He capitulated, and the world turns out just fine afterwards. And it's a very black and white thing. Shyamalan won't rest until all of the answers are as clear and cookie cutter as can be. And yeah, I know throughout the film they're trying to be like, we're not targeting you because you're gay, but it's still, when you have an ending like that, it brings up certain feelings and ideas and thoughts, and so, you can tell me one thing, but when you're showing me another, that's kind of where the disconnect happens. It's so odd that Knock at the Cabin was released just a few days after the third episode of The Last of Us. It's so jarring to see such a positive and emotionally beautiful representation of queer love in the latter, one which even ends with both halves of the couple in question passing away, but also something really beautiful and fulfilling of their lives and even their passing be followed up by an almost cliched fulfillment of bury your gays-esque gay trauma and sacrifice. It's so outdated. It's more than possible to acknowledge bigotry while still allowing for something fulfilling and both life and love affirming to play out. Yeah, I mean, you can look at Eric's sacrifice as being out of love, but when you're kind of covering it up with other stuff, I don't think it necessarily hits the way Shyamalan intended it to. Knock at the Cabin just feels soul-crushing and numbing. And look, I get that the story being told here is not one about happiness. I also recognize that representation should mean gay characters experience all areas of the spectrum of hardship on screen. Gay men experience deep hardships and tragedy in the real world every day. They're faced with excruciatingly tough decisions every day, and for art and media to pretend otherwise is a disservice. I do think Shyamalan tries to get at that, albeit way too late in the film after that meandering back and forth hour about the oncoming apocalypse and how bad it is, and oh, is it the apocalypse? Is it not the apocalypse? It's, oh, look, it's getting worse. A film like this just feels exhausting, and it's not helped by Eric's dialogue. It's really atrocious, and it didn't need to be. There's an element of, I'm doing this so our daughter has a future she deserves, and if the film leaned into that more, leaned into the emotional aspect instead of the logical, over-explaining aspect of the story, I think this all could have worked out in the end. But instead, Shyamalan makes that reason for his sacrifice a footnote, and instead it's more about, I saw Jesus, the vision in the reflection, and now I'm a convert to Christianity, the cause of Leonard and the Doomsday Predictors. The movie over-explains this side of why Eric decides to sacrifice himself, and it completely dulls the emotions, as it does for really all of Shyamalan's films when he attempts to over-explain the emotionality of his films. If Shyamalan Shyamalan could, for once, just trust the audience to get that Eric did this out of love for his daughter and leave it at that, it would have been more universal and powerful, and that's ultimately what a movie like Signs has that this doesn't. He overcooks it to the point of it backfiring, resulting in the unintentional validation of some people who hold prejudices against the gay community. This obviously wasn't Shyamalan's intention, and I know that. It was a fault of the real-life circumstances at hand, but it's such a severe miscalculation that could have been entirely fixed, along with so much of the film's unclear commentary as a whole, if it was about a father sacrificing himself for his daughter rather than being swayed over the edge of doing so by hallucinations and fear-mongering about an impending rapture. But it's such a severe miscalculation that could have been entirely fixed, ironically so, had Shyamalan not quote-unquote fixed the ending to the original source material. And that also would have helped with the film's unclear commentary as a whole. But that's Knock at the Cabin, a film that starts out ambiguous, interestingly so, isn't necessarily giving you the answers, and then Shyamalan feels the need to dump it all on you right when the emotional climax is happening, dulling any sort of impact that he was hoping for. I don't walk away from it feeling anything other than numb. And ultimately, whatever the film was trying to say largely goes in one ear and out the other, because it just throws a bunch of noise at you without really saying anything of actual substance. I get the conversation being had, and I like the environmental messaging, but the story gets so muddled in an idea about belief being what the individual makes of it, and that's all that matters. And if that's what Shyamalan wants to tell me, well, I'll just go pop in my DVD of Signs.